Let's get all the facts on the table. Coronavirus, COVID-19, the whole thing was premeditated. It was murder. It was active terrorism by a state against the world. Let's call it what it is. And let's not pretend like maybe there's a more complex explanation for, I don't know, the facts. And the facts are, here's the bad news, for 58 years, the United States, the UK, in collaboration with researchers around the world, planned to use coronavirus to instill the most tyrannical reform of society that this generation has ever seen. And they did it purely premeditated to make sure that we were cowed into submission. And the bad news for them is there's a lot of people that didn't take the knee.
It's just incredible when you start going through the dates, and maybe just take us back to some of these dates, 1965, 1967, 1990, where these events, and when you do it, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. And again, the beautiful thing about your work in Plandemic 2 is that there was no emotion, there was no opinion, it was all facts. It was published documents where you can literally show, and as you walk us right up to '02 and right us up to 2020, you literally have specific mentions about exactly what's going to happen. Yeah. That document what you just said, because a lot of people will hear what you just said and be like, okay, here's another one who's making these claims, but you can document every single thing you're saying.
Well, and not only can I, in the EU Parliament speech, I actually put every single reference in. There's not a single thing I said that's not referenced with the source document behind it. So you can read it, do it yourself. Go read it, read the document, draw a different conclusion. It is a particularly interesting location for me to be sitting today, given that over a decade ago I sat in this very chair right here in the European Union Parliament. And at that time I warned the world of what was coming. During that conversation that was hosted at the time by the Green and EFA and a number of the other parties of the European Union's various representations, we were having a conversation on whether Europe should adopt the United States policy of allowing for the patents on biologically derived materials. And at the time, I urged this body, and I urged people around the world, that the weaponization of nature against humanity had dire consequences. Tragically, I sit here today with that unfortunate line that I don't like to say, which I told you so. But the fact of the matter is, we're here not for a reprisal on past decisions. We're here to actually, once again, come to the face of the human condition and ask the question, who do we want to be? What do we want humanity to look like? And rather than seeing this as an exercise in futility, which is very easy from time to time when you're in the position I'm in, I actually see this not as an exercise in futility. I see this as one of the greatest opportunities that faces us, because we now have a public conversation, which is now front and center in people's minds. When this was an esoteric conversation about biological patents, nobody cared. But when that conversation came home, then it became something people can care about. So I'm actually quite grateful for this opportunity. I thank the members of Parliament for hosting this. I thank all of the translators who, I apologize in advance. I will use terminology that is probably very difficult to translate, so my apologies. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that many of you are aware of my involvement with this, in large part due to the amazing work of my wonderful wife, Kim Martin, who encouraged me at the very early days of this pandemic to get on front of the camera and talk about all the information that I had been sharing among very small groups around the world. And it was, in fact, her encouragement that put me in a place where many of you have heard what I have to say. Ironically, the world that I came from, that used to be very popular, my CNBC and Bloomberg presentations, which were televised on mainstream media around the world, was an audience that I lost. I can confidently say COVID diminished my fame. But I can also confidently say that I'd rather stand among the people with whom I'm standing today than any of the folks that were part of that previous world. So this is a much better place to be. My role today is to set the stage for this conversation in a historical context, because this did not come in the last 3 years. This did not come in the last 5 or 6 years. This actually is an ongoing question that probably began here in Europe in the early stages of the mid-1900s, but certainly by 1913, 1914, this conversation started right here in Central Europe. The pandemic that we alleged to have happen in the last few years also did not happen overnight. In fact, the very specific pandemic using coronavirus began in a very different time. And we'll try to advance the slides here with one of these things. Oh, there we go. Most of you don't know that coronavirus as a model of a pathogen was isolated in 1965. Coronavirus was identified in 1965 as one of the first infectious replicatable viral models that could be used to modify a series of other experiences of the human condition. It was isolated once upon a time associated with the common cold. But what's particularly interesting about its isolation in 1965 was that it was immediately identified as a pathogen that could be used and modified for a whole host of reasons. And you heard me correctly, that was 1965. And by the way, these slides are public domain. You're welcome to look at every single reference. Every comment that I made is based on published material, so do make sure that you look at those references. But in 1966, the very first COV coronavirus model was used as a transatlantic biological experiment in human manipulation. And you heard the date, 1966. I hope you're getting the point of what I'm saying. This is not an overnight thing. This is actually something that's been long in the making. A year before I was born, we had the first transatlantic coronavirus data sharing experiment between the United States and the United Kingdom. And in 1967, the year I was born, we did the first human trials on inoculating people with modified coronavirus. Isn't that amazing? 56 years ago, the overnight success of a pathogen that's been 56 years in engineering. And I want that to chill with all of you. Where were we when we actually allowed, in violation of biological and chemical weapons treaties, where were we as a human civilization when we thought it was an acceptable thing to do to take a pathogen for the United States and infect the world with it? Where was that conversation? And what should have been that conversation in 1967? That conversation wasn't had. Ironically, the common cold was turned into a chimera in the 1970s. And in 1975, 1976, and 1977, we started figuring out how to modify coronavirus by putting it into different animals, pigs and dogs. And not surprisingly, by the time we got to 1990, we found out that coronavirus as an infectious agent was an industrial problem for two primary industries, the industries of dogs and pigs. Dog breeders and pigs found that coronavirus created gastrointestinal problems, and that became the basis for Pfizer's first spike protein vaccine patent, filed, are you ready for this, in 1990. Did you hear what I just said? 1990. Operation Warp Speed? I'm sorry. Where's the warp and the speed? Pfizer, 1990, the very first spike protein vaccine for coronavirus. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't it fascinating that we were told that, well, the spike protein is a new thing. We just found out that that's the problem. No. As a matter of fact, we didn't just find out it was not just now the problem. We found that out in 1990 and filed the first patents on vaccines in 1990 for the spike protein of coronavirus. And who would have thought? Pfizer. Clearly the innocent organization that does nothing but promote human health. Clearly Pfizer. The organization that has not bought the votes in this chamber and in every chamber of every government around the world. Not that Pfizer. Certainly they wouldn't have had anything to do with this. But oh yes, they did. And in 1990, they found out that there was a problem with vaccines. They didn't work. You know why they didn't work? It turns out that coronavirus is a very malleable model. It transforms and it changes and it mutates over time. As a matter of fact, every publication on vaccines for coronavirus from 1990 until 2018, every single publication concluded that coronavirus escapes the vaccine impulse because it modifies and mutates too quickly for vaccines to be effective. And since 1990 to 2018, that is the published science, ladies and gentlemen. That's following the science. Following the science is their own indictment of their own programs that said it doesn't work. And there are thousands of publications to that effect, not a few hundred, and not paid for by pharmaceutical companies. These are publications that are independent scientific research that shows unequivocally, including efforts of the chimera modifications made by Ralph Baric in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. All of them show vaccines do not work on coronavirus. That's the science. And that science has never been disputed. But then we had an interesting development in 2002. And this date is most important. Because in 2002, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill patented, and I quote, an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Listen to those words, infectious replication defective. What does that phrase actually mean? For those of you not familiar with language, let me unpack it for you. Infectious replication defective means a weapon. It means something meant to target an individual, but not have collateral damage to other individuals. That's what infectious replication defective means. And that patent was filed in 2002 on work funded by NIAID's Anthony Fauci from 1999 to 2002. And that work, patented at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, mysteriously preceded SARS 1.0 by a year. Dave, are you suggesting that SARS 1.0 wasn't from a wet market in Wuhan? Are you suggesting it might have come from a laboratory in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill? No, I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you that's the facts. We engineered SARS. SARS is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. The naturally occurring phenomenon is called the common cold. It's called influenza-like illness. It's called gastroenteritis. That's the naturally occurring coronavirus. SARS is the research developed by humans weaponizing a life system model to actually attack human beings. And they patented it in 2002. And in 2003, giant surprise, the CDC filed the patent on coronavirus isolated from humans in violation, once again, of biological and chemical weapons treaties and laws that we have in the United States. And I'm very, very precise on this. The United States likes to talk about its rights and everything else and the rule of law and all the nonsense that we like to talk about. But we don't ratify treaties about, I don't know, defending humans. We conspicuously avoid that. We actually have a great track record of advocating for human rights and then denying them when it comes to actually being part of the international community, which is a slightly problematic thing. But let's get something very clear. When the CDC in April of 2003 filed the patent on SARS coronavirus isolated from humans, what did they do? They downloaded a sequence from China and filed a patent on it in the United States. Any of you familiar with biological and chemical weapons treaties knows that's a violation. That's a crime. That's not an innocent oops. That's a crime. And the United States Patent Office went as far as to reject that patent application on 2 occasions until the CDC decided to bribe the Patent Office to override the patent examiner to ultimately issue the patent in 2007 on SARS coronavirus. But let's not let that get away from us, because it turns out that the RT-PCR, which was the test that we allegedly were going to use to identify the risks associated with coronavirus, was actually identified as a bioterrorism threat by me in the European Union sponsored events in 2002 and 2003, 20 years ago. That happened here in Brussels and across Europe. In 2005, this particular pathogen was specifically labeled as a bioterrorism and bioweapon platform technology. Described as such. That's not my terminology that I'm applying to it. It was actually described as a bioweapons platform technology in 2005. And from 2005 onwards, it was actually a biowarfare enabling agent, its official classification from 2005 forward. I don't know if that sounds like public health to you. Does it? Biological warfare enabling technology. That feels like not public health. That feels like not medicine. That feels like a weapon designed to take out humanity. That's what it feels like. And it feels like that because that's exactly what it is. We have been lured into believing that EcoHealth Alliance and DARPA and all of these organizations are what we should be pointing to. But we've been specifically requested to ignore the facts that over $10 billion have been funneled through black operations through the check of Anthony Fauci and a side-by-side ledger where NIAID has a balance sheet and next to it is a biodefense balance sheet equivalent dollar-for-dollar matching that no one in the media talks about. And it's been going on since 2005. Our gain-of-function moratorium, the moratorium that was supposed to freeze any efforts to do gain-of-function research. Conveniently, in the fall of 2014, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill received a letter from NIAID saying that while the gain-of-function moratorium on coronavirus in vivo should be suspended, because their grants had already been funded, they received an exemption. Did you hear what I just said? A biological weapons lab facility at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, received an exemption from the gain-of-function moratorium so that by 2016 we could publish the journal article that said SARS coronavirus is poised for human emergence in 2016. And what, you might ask, Dave, was the coronavirus poised for human emergence? It was WIV1, Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. Poised for human emergence in 2016 at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, such that by the time we get to 2017 and 2018, the following phrase entered into common parlance among the community. There is going to be an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. The operative word, obviously, in that phrase, the word release. Does that sound like leak? Does that sound like a bat and a pangolin went into a bar in the Wuhan market and hung out and had sex and lo and behold, we got SARS-CoV-2? No. Accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen was the terminology used, and 4 times in April of 2019, 7 months before the allegation of patient number 1, 4 patent applications of Moderna were modified to include the term accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen as the justification for making a vaccine for a thing that did not exist. Keep going. If you have not done so, please make sure that you make reference in every investigation to the premeditation nature of this, because it was in September of 2019 that the world was informed that we were going to have an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen so that by September 2020, there would be a worldwide acceptance of a universal vaccine template. That's their words, right in front of you on the screen. The intent was to get the world to accept a universal vaccine template, and the intent was to use coronavirus to get there. And the last slide. This isn't advancing, so if I could have somebody do it. Let's read this, because we have to read this into the record everywhere I go. Until an infectious disease crisis is very real, present, and at the emergency threshold, it is often largely ignored. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, he said, we need to increase the public understanding for the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Sounds like public health? Sounds like the best of humanity? No, ladies and gentlemen, this was premeditated domestic terrorism stated at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, published in front of them. This is an act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race, and it was admitted to in writing that this was a financial heist and a financial fraud. Investors will follow if they see profit at the end of the process. Let me conclude by making 5 very brief recommendations. The last slide. Nature was hijacked. This whole story started in 1965 when we decided to hijack a natural model and decide to start manipulating it. Science was hijacked when the only questions that could be asked were questions authorized under the patent protection of the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, and their equivalent organizations around the world. We didn't have independent science. We had hijacked science. And unfortunately, there was no moral oversight in violation of all of the codes that we stand for. There was no independent, financially disinterested, independent review board ever impaneled around coronavirus, not once. Not once. Not since 1965. We do not have a single independent IRB ever impaneled around coronavirus. So morality was suspended for medical countermeasures. And ultimately, humanity was lost because we decided to allow it to happen. Our job today is to say, no more gain-of-function research, period. No more weaponization of nature, period. And most importantly, no more corporate patronage of science for their own self-interest unless they assume 100% product liability for every injury and every death that they maintain. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thanks, Eric, and welcome to everybody who's watching. I am not going to retread the ground that I have tread many times. For those of you who have not been familiar with the work, you can go to prosecutenow.com. And at prosecutenow.com, you will see the Utah federal case that we have filed against the president, against CMS, and against the Department of Health and Human Services. If you want to understand why we refuse to use the term vaccination, that's the reason why. So go to prosecutenow.com. There you'll also see the summary of litigation, and you'll also see the draft indictment. What I can say is that we have 3 different law enforcement agencies who, in fact, are working with us right now on the development of the very first criminal indictment against one of the sociopaths that architected this global campaign of terror. And you will be hearing more about that between now and the 22nd of May. So the crime is coming. And if you haven't read the Utah filing, please do, because it is actually extremely, extremely important. And obviously, some of you are aware that George whence Leslie Manukian hired me and George to build the case that ultimately led to the Florida decision that removed masks from airplanes. So we have the first win, which obviously is now benefiting everybody who has to ever be in a plane. And we are now in the middle of the preliminary injunction phase of the Utah case against CMS. But I wanted to lean heavily into the Canadian side of this question. But I want to make sure we stipulate something out of the gate. This is not a public health situation. This is not even a science situation. And while I appreciate the public health people and the scientists who love to talk about the nuance of this, it is like commenting on the merits of firearms at a shooting. This is a case of murder. It is not a case of disease. It is not a case of pandemic. This is a case of murder. And people who are currently doing the delivery of the agent of that murder are in fact people who wear lab coats. If they wore anything else, if they wore hoodies, they wore anything else, we'd call them murderers. Right now, we call them doctors. The fact of the matter is, this is premeditated global terrorism. This is premeditated domestic terrorism. And this is premeditated racketeering. And the reason why I say that is because the evidence is that Canada and the United States collaborated, and specifically during the gain of function moratorium. For those of you who actually don't understand the dynamics of this, the weaponization of the spike protein associated with WIV1, which is the Wuhan Institute of Virology virus 1, which was sampled from China reportedly between 2011 and 2013, which was replicated at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2013 and 14, which was the subject of the moratorium on the gain of function research, where Anthony Fauci said to Ralph Baric at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in October of 2014, that while there was in fact a gain of function moratorium, his work on the weaponization of the Wuhan Institute of Virology virus spike protein was able to go on because, I quote, he had already been funded, end quote. And this study, which was done in vivo, resulted in 2 papers, one in 2015 and one in 2016, both stating that the Wuhan Institute of Virology virus 1 spike protein targeting endothelial tissue, targeting lung tissue, targeting kidney tissue, he stated that it was, and I'm quoting, poised for human emergence. So anybody who wants to sit here and pretend like this is anything other than premeditated murder is actually watching freight cars roll across Germany and wondering where neighbors are going. The fact is that there is no question whatsoever that this was a premeditated act of murder. And for those of you who have not heard it, I will not get on a show without reciting the evidence. In March of 2015, Peter Daszak, the chief architect of the deployment of this particular campaign of terror, along with Anthony Fauci and Ralph Baric, Peter Daszak made the following statement. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, we need to increase the public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. If you think that this is an issue that has anything to do with a virus spreading in a pandemic, you are delusional. This is a premeditated crime. They announced the crime in 2015, and conveniently, the government of Canada entered into an agreement with the distribution of the lethal agent in 2015. And specifically, that was Thomas Madden, that was Peter Cullis, and that was Peter Cullis, Thomas Madden, and Ian McLaughlin, who at the University of British Columbia developed a lipid nanoparticle that was required to first demonstrate the ability to actually do what was called gene silencing in monkeys, and then took that technology after a lawsuit, which was a $65 million lawsuit. The settlement of that lawsuit in 2012, and for those in Canada, look up that lawsuit. It was the lawsuit between Protiva, Tecmira, Alcanna Therapeutics, and the University of British Columbia. After the $65 million settlement was paid in that particular case, in 2015, Alcanna Therapeutics, owned by Thomas Madden and Peter Cullis, sub-licensed the lipid nanoparticle technology to Moderna for the development of an mRNA vaccine during the gain-of-function moratorium in violation of U.S. and Canadian law, because it's illegal in Canada to support and make a agent which enables the delivery of a biological weapon. That's actually illegal in Canada. And it's illegal to develop and aid in the development of a biological weapon in the United States. Those are felony violations of two parts of the criminal code of the United States, 18 U.S. Code subsection 2339, which is conspiring to commit acts of terrorism, and 18 U.S. Code section 175, funding and creating a biological weapon. The fact of the matter is, Alcanna, Acuitas, and the University of British Columbia, together with Moderna, are in fact guilty of felony violations of 18 U.S. Code Section 175. And that felony violation took place in 2015, specifically during the gain-of-function moratorium. Any law enforcement official who is actually doing anything in support of Trudeau is aiding and abetting the criminal acts of the government of Canada, the criminal acts of the University of British Columbia, and the criminal acts of Acuitas, Alcanna, and its principals, Thomas Madden and Peter Cullis. So, lest we sit here and pretend to stand on ceremony, the fact of the matter is, it does not matter what clinical trials have or haven't been done. That's like debating the merits of copper when a bullet is in a corpse. That is a foolish exercise. What we need to be doing is focusing all of our efforts single-handedly and directly on the criminal prosecution of terrorists who have now aided and abetted in the murder of millions. And just to put a fine point on this thing, Ralph Baric at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in addition to being the architect of the spike protein weaponized to destroy humanity, also holds patent interest in the invention of remdesivir, which was known in its clinical trials in the early 2000s to be lethal when used in patients for a number of other pathogens. And willfully and knowingly distributing an agent that is in fact known to be harmful and fatal to humans is premeditated murder. And the fact that all of the governments inside the earshot of who's listening right now have adopted the remdesivir protocol and have adopted the acceptance of the narrative that this is in fact some sort of variation of coronavirus. The fact of the matter is neither are the case. This is in fact a bioweapon delivered by a carrier agent developed by the government of Canada. And given that Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna both pay royalties to Canadian interests, every single shot administered from Pfizer or from Moderna involve license fees that flow back to the government of Canada. So this is racketeering at the highest level, and the Canadian government is complicit and guilty of racketeering and conspiring to fund the commission of acts of terror. Eric, you know, I could go on, as you know, for hours and hours and hours, but the point is really simple. I am tired of the conversations around debating the merits of the fine points of whether or not viruses or other things exist or don't exist. The fact of the matter is we have to focus on the crime that's being committed. We have to put our efforts on that crime. And 100% of what I'm doing is making sure that the entire world knows that anybody who actually promotes a narrative that says that there is a novel disease, anyone who promotes the narrative that says that there's a novel pathogen, and any lawyer who stipulates that there are either of those things is as complicit as Trudeau and Fauci. It's time that we draw a line in the sand and say, we the people will not stand for the domestic and international terrorism that is being done in the name of health. And that's it. That's the wrap. That's what I'm doing.
Point out, which brings us to our final speaker. He's been all over the world. He's an American inventor, entrepreneur, and public speaker with a diverse background in finance, technology, and intellectual property. He holds a PhD from the University of Virginia, where he also served as a Batten Fellow at the Darden Graduate School of Business Administration. He founded MCAM Inc. in 1998, a company focused on intangible asset finance, patent quality assessment, and innovation funding. His work has positioned him as a global advocate for intellectual property accountability, collaborating with entities like the U.S. Congress, the European Union, and various regulatory agencies across 160 countries. In regards to COVID-19, he has illuminated us all on the origins of the virus, the role of patents, and the motivations behind the pandemic response. Alberta, please give a warm welcome to Dr. David E. Martin.
All right. Is this on? Here we go. You got it. You know, I watched the hockey game, right? So I'm not going to boo, but there is a slide in here which you're going to really want to, you know, break their rules and take a picture of, because I have a "Oh My God, Canada," which is as close to the national anthem as I'm going to get tonight. But my job here is just back cleanup. I mean, I listen to everybody else. You've had some amazing opportunities to get your, you know, aperture opened up, see some things that you haven't seen before. And my job is to not be nice. That's partially because, you know, I come from the land down under, you know, so there is that whole 51st state thing that we're talking about. And I feel like we're a little bit more at home in Alberta, because we at least say, let's, you know, get a free trade zone between the two of us or something like that. So now, but I do have to say, I'm not going to be nice. Now, everybody up here has been super cool, and it's like, well, we don't really know why, and we don't. That's bullshit. And I grew up hand milking cows on a farm in Pennsylvania, and one of the things you learn when you're milking cows by hand is which end shit comes out of. And that's shit. So let's call it what it is. This was a mass planned genocide. You cannot accidentally kill people. And I can assure you that the cabinet and the premier of this province are actively involved in reckless homicide today. So stop kissing people's ass. If any injection goes into any arm from this moment forward, you are on notice. And it goes from reckless homicide to premeditated murder after I get done with my speech. That's what it is. So stop pretending it isn't. And I'm tired of this soft peddling where we're supposed to be nice to genocidal, homicidal maniacs. It's time that we stop pretending and start calling them out. Okay, so I get it. I get it. We want political sensitivity. But you know what you can't have? You can't have what happened at the end of the Nuremberg trials. At the end of the Nuremberg trials, we decided that about 20 bad guys needed to go on trial. We killed most of them. Some went to jail. A couple of them died in the process. But what we never did was we never talked about the doctors who actually did the actual studies on human subjects in the camps. We didn't talk about the pharmacists and the chemical companies that did all of the chemistry that went into killing people. We didn't do any of that because we decided, because it was fashionable to decide, that we're going to hold a couple people accountable and everybody else just says sorry. See, I said it the right way, Canada. Sorry. Well, kiss my sorry ass. You cannot do that. Every single pharmacy, every single public health officer, by 2018 had the ability, if they are literate, to know that absolutely everything in this injection was lethal. Every single component was known and published to be lethal in 2018. For those of you not familiar with a conventional calendar, that's 2 years before all this nonsense happened. So anybody who tells me we were doing our best to follow the science is lying. And I'm not interested in having a civil conversation with lying, genocidal, homicidal maniacs. I'm interested in pointing out the facts. And I'm going to do that really fast. Now, von Hayek is very famous for this quote, and I love this. And by the way, seriously, if you want to take a picture of the slide, these are all yours. You can take a picture of it now, you can take a picture of it later, it doesn't matter. But the great news is we need to understand that this principle, which von Hayek talked about in Austria, is in fact a principle that we have to keep in mind all the time. And the problem, if you read the rest of his essay, is not only do we like to use emergencies to instill a permanent alteration in things, but the problem is we don't go back to the pre-emergency condition. We never go back to the pre-emergency condition. And that's unacceptable, because this is a way to manipulate a public into accepting a thing it would not otherwise accept. And we know that because they've said it. Right? Now we have CEOs of pharmaceutical companies that said, if we told people it was a gene therapy, they would have never taken it. Okay, newsflash. They did tell you it was a gene therapy. Every single one of the manufacturers did. The FDA's official document on mRNA said it was an experimental gene therapy. And they said that if we don't call it a vaccination, people won't take it. But it turns out that deceptive medical practices is illegal on both sides of the Canadian-US border. And not a single person has decided to file those charges. Not one. And that's a simple one. That's low-hanging fruit. Now, I am obligated, because I actually have what's called a moral compass. I know that's a very rare thing these days. But I'm obligated every time I get on stage to point this out. This is actually a quote published March 2015 from a statement that was made in 2014 by the co-conspirators who brought us the COVID-19 scam. And I want to read it. To sustain the funding base. Let's start with that sentence. Does that sound like public health to you? Let's keep reading because it gets better. Beyond the crisis, we need to increase the public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. Remember the date on this? It was stated in 2014, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in March of 2015. Anybody familiar with how long before COVID that was? And by the way, during that period of time, the World Health Organization had said that SARS-CoV was already are you ready for this? An eradicated disease. So why would we need a vaccine for an eradicated disease, declared such by the World Health Organization? Oh, that's right, because it never was a disease. SARS 1.0 wasn't either. SARS 1.0 was the first round of the bioweapon release, and SARS 2.0 was the second round. And newsflash, we get to the real interesting piece. And by the way, is there like media in this room? Awesome. So let's go ahead and do this, because here's your indictment. And you sucker punched into this, and then you're not smart enough to do the simple research to go, hey, newsflash, maybe we should have read the operating plan, which says a key driver is the media and the economics will follow the hype. Did you hear that one? That sounds like public health through and through. The economics will follow the hype. I don't know. I didn't get a journalism degree, but hype doesn't feel like following the science, does it? People, listen, we've been duped, but part of the problem is you all have actually sat there and gone, well, that sounds like a bad thing. Clearly, there must have been a good motivation for it. No, there wasn't, because let's finish the sentence. We need to use the hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Wow. Wow. You think that investors will respond is a statement that says the Alberta government and AHS were trying to do their best. Bullshit. Not a single one of them told you the truth. And it's not kind of a lie. This was actually domestic terrorism for the purpose of reckless homicide leading to now premeditated murder. That's what it was. So stop pretending it isn't. Now, people get upset when I do this because I like to show people the inconvenient things called facts. And by the way, the reason why I continue to move around the globe largely unimpeded is because I say things that if they weren't true, I'd be sued for libel. Because I say nasty things about bad people. And we were just told we're not supposed to really judge. Well, guess what? I'm not judging. I'm not judging. I'm just pointing out, I don't know, the self-evident facts, like April of 2001, April 20th of 2001, when the CDC decided to file the patent on the human coronavirus isolated from humans. Isn't it fascinating that only 2 days later, in 2001, there was a vaccine for the thing that had been invented 2 days earlier? Now, I don't know if you're familiar with science, but that feels kind of back to the future-ish. That's like a Doc Brown moment to what? Go into the future to get data on the thing that had been discovered 2 days earlier and filed in, oh, that's right, a paper patent in the patent office, which could have not been disclosed for 18 months. So somehow mysteriously, a thing that had not been invented already had a vaccine for the thing that had been discovered 2 days earlier, with data in the patent on the vaccine for a thing that had happened 2 days earlier, according to the official record. Ladies and gentlemen, that actually doesn't really happen in the world unless criminals are colluding. That's the CDC, and that's a little company called Sequoia Pharmaceuticals. Now, you're all familiar with this image because I've used it before. But what I wanted to show you is, for those of you not familiar with it, this nonsense started in 1965. And that means that for those of you who are not paying attention, 12 years after the model of DNA was isolated, right? So this 1953 is when DNA started being recognized. So only 12 years later, the first thing that we found that we could turn into a biological weapon was coronavirus. Did you know that? That was the first thing we discovered. And it turns out that across the next 2 years, the United States and the United Kingdom decided to send infected tissue between the US and the UK to see if we could infect healthy volunteers. I don't know how you guys do volunteers up here, but I don't know that I would necessarily sign up if I had informed consent that says, yeah, go ahead and shove that thing up my nose because I want to test a thing to see if it causes a thing. That's a stupid proposition. But by 1966 and 1967, we actually established that coronavirus was the best viral model to use as a vector to get people infected with other things. That's kind of an interesting problem when you realize that in 2000, Pfizer filed its first vaccine patent on the spike protein. Doesn't that sound like warp speed? Now, I'm familiar. We're up in Calgary and we're in Alberta, so I know that you guys know what maple syrup is up here. This warp speed was running as fast as maple syrup doesn't run in, say, February in the tundra. The spike protein vaccine that Pfizer filed was in 2000. 2000. Oops. That doesn't sound like warp speed, does it? And the reason why you don't know about this particular patent or the research associated with it is everything that it was injected into died. Oops. Now, the reason why you don't know about this is conveniently, we decided that we weren't going to play with that until we got to April of 2002. In April of 2002, Ralph Baric and his team of minions at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, patented what I'm now quoting from their patent was the infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. That meant that we were going to take the coronavirus model, we were going to turn it into an envelope, we're going to put other things into that envelope, and we're going to deliver that into the cells so that it can infect people. But this is actually the admission that it's a bullet. It's a bullet. It's meant to hit a target, but unlike virus models that had been advanced before, this one wasn't supposed to propagate. And lo and behold, that patent filed in 2002 became SARS 1.0. Do you all know that? That was the patent on SARS 1.0. And the reason why I know it was because when we had SARS 1.0, we were told that this was going to be a pandemic that was going to ravage the earth. And guess what happened? About 800 people got sick and died. And probably, like in COVID, most of them were dying anyhow. But what we do know is that the weapon didn't go off the way it was supposed to. And there was a lot of people that were upset about that. So they decided that they needed to up the ante. Not surprisingly, we actually had the gain of function research that was approved the next year in 2003 so that the CDC and Sequoia Pharmaceuticals could actually figure that out. Now, my first briefing on all this nonsense happened in 2002. So when people say I'm somehow a COVID specialist, I'm not. I've been doing bioweapons inspections for the United States government since the 1980s and 1990s. So the bad news is I've been around this game a long time. I know how the game is played. We make a weapon, we deploy a weapon, and then we tell people that they need to come to us to rescue themselves from the weapon that we just deployed. And that's the game plan. That's what happened here. But there's a very interesting thing that happened when, in 2005, this is the part that everybody gets upset about, and I'm going to go ahead and speak directly to your provincial government here, when they actually pretend like this is just a pandemic and they were doing their best. The architect of this called this biowarfare enabling technology in 2005. Now, Canada has laws against biological warfare. Did you know that? Really robust laws. You actually adopted the post-Nuremberg laws that actually suggested that it's a bad idea to have biological weapons. Now, mind you, Canada hasn't paid attention to following or honoring that law, but you at least have the law. We don't have it. Because despite the fact that the United States prosecuted the Nuremberg trials, we did not adopt the Nuremberg Code, which everybody in the US seems to forget. Like, we didn't do it. We came up with the rule and then we decided, not for us. I know it's terribly American to do that, come up with a rule for everybody else, and it doesn't apply to America because we just know better. But the problem I want to show you on this particular slide is the fact that the lie that you were told about safe and effective was known to be a lie in 2010. In 2010, when the National Science Foundation grant, which was called Darwinian Chemical Systems, did you hear that? Let me just repeat it. Darwinian Chemical Systems. Anybody feeling good about that? That's a warm and fuzzy kind of Christmas feeling for you. When that grant showed that it was possible to take mRNA and transfect and translate it into human DNA and other cell lines, that's when Moderna, the company, was born. Moderna is the outgrowth of that grant. The first patent is the co-investigator on the National Science Foundation grant and the lead investor of Flagship Biosciences, which was the investment bank firm that actually put the check in to create Moderna. Interestingly enough, no real history on that. And that's going to ring a little tiny bell when we come back to sometimes funding happens and nobody really knows where the money came from. University of British Columbia. Not that I'm mentioning a Canadian interest, University of British Columbia. Which leads us to the decade of the vaccines in 2011, which is when the Gates Foundation, National Institutes of Health, NIAID, the Wellcome Trust, all of the Chinese CDC, all of the US CDC, and a lot of our allies got together and said in 2011, by September of 2020, the universal vaccine will be accepted globally. That was in 2011 in a publication called The Decade of Vaccines, published by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board of the World Health Organization. Now, I don't know how you are with forecasting up here in Calgary, but if you can forecast that the world is going to accept a universal vaccine by 2020 and 2011, that's a 9 years hence kind of projection. There's a high probability that you have a plan to do that. Well, they did have a plan. And that plan was published again inside of what was called the World at Risk publication. It was published on September 18th, 2019, in which the following was stated: a rapidly spreading pandemic due to a lethal respiratory pathogen, whether naturally emergent or accidentally or deliberately released. That was published September 18th, 2019. There are two words in that sentence that are highly problematic to all the BS that we hear about at conferences like this. The term lethal before respiratory pathogen, that's a problem, because that means we knew it was deadly. And then the word released. You know what you don't hear about in any of the, how did it get into circulation? Was it a lab leak?
Was it the Wuhan wet market? Was it a bat and a pangolin that went into a bar and got on a bender one night after a hockey game? What was it? Oh, that's right. Accidental or intentional release. That's an act, ladies and gentlemen. That is not an accident. That is an act. And what was the metric? By September 2020, the world would accept a universal vaccine. Stop pretending not to know. It's insulting to your intelligence and to everyone's intelligence. Stop pretending not to know. They knew they were going to kill people for the purpose of instilling terror. They knew that the intervention that they were going to do was going to kill people. And by September of 2018, oh my God, Canada, I promised you the slide. That is the legal proceedings of the University of British Columbia's fight with Moderna on who owned lipid nanoparticles. Oh, that's right. Decided in the Patent Trial Appeals Board in November of 2018. Did you hear the date on that? Now, coincident with this mysterious lawsuit where Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna were fighting with the University of British Columbia's various corporations, and holy cow, if you look at the history of those corporations, it reads literally like a bloodbath. Like, oh, that's right. Some of the investors in these corporations died in a plane crash that might have taken out a former premier. Did I say that out loud in Canada? I'm not supposed to say that because that would suggest that somebody was trying to kill the evidence. Except they were. And that's why that happened. And we're sitting here pretending like, oops, we don't know anything about that. Just look the other way. Well, here's a tiny little problem. Don't look the other way. When you have to murder people to cover up an international crime, we should be concerned about that. We should be equally concerned about the fact that here in Canada, we enabled the largest genocide in human history, courtesy of University of British Columbia. The largest genocide in human history, enabled right here in Canada. That sucks. Yeah, a lot of people are sorry. And I like that we're at least saying sorry the way we should say sorry. Because I get sorry about that. That's a twofer right there from a yank. That's pretty good. Sorry about that. But nobody bothers to look at this, and nobody bothers to look at the dates on this thing, and nobody bothers to look at the communications around the dates on this and go, hold on a second. Why was Arbutus and Acuitas and all these other companies, why were they so freaking interested in mRNA vaccines when, oh, that's right, nobody was manufacturing them? Why would you have a patent fight, a very costly patent fight? Why would you do that if there was no commercial interest in the thing that you were fighting about? Unless there was a commercial interest in the thing you were fighting about, in which case you would be fighting about that thing. And it turns out I made these allegations. I've been told I'm very anti-Canadian, and I'm probably, just an American with an axe to grind? No. The crime could only have happened if UBC was allowed with impunity to enable biological warfare enabling technologies. And that is a violation of Canadian law. And you know what I've not seen a single Canadian do? Even allege what I just said. Even allege it. Not a single Canadian. Why is a bow tie wearing Virginian from the United States the only one that has I don't know which part of the anatomy you need, but I'll go ahead and let you fill in whatever piece of anatomy you think. Why is it that a bow tie wearing Virginian is the only one that seems to point out Canadian law, which says that if you enable the production and distribution of biological weapon, you are guilty of penalties that include years in prison, hundreds of millions of dollars of fines, and I understand it's Canadian dollars and those suck, so let's call it half of hundreds of millions of dollars of crimes, until Alberta becomes the state, and then we have dollars, and then that's all good. And then Canada participates in my favorite thing, which is this little thing, which was the EHCR, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the modification of a little thing that the World Health Organization did in 2018, which was really cool. What they did was they decided to change the definition of an adverse event following vaccination so that it could only be an adverse event if there was published literature proving that the event was an adverse event based on the vaccination. Is that really clever? You're going to roll out a thing that's never been used. You're not even going to have it be a vaccination. You're going to have it be a genetically modified product that is supposed to genetically modify an organism. We don't have any data on it. We don't have any safety, efficacy, anything else data. We don't have any data on the thing, but we're going to go ahead and roll it out. And it cannot by law have an adverse event because we changed the law on what an adverse event is. Which means everybody can die from this thing, and every public health agency around the world can get up and say there were no adverse events. You know why? Because they changed the legal definition of what an adverse event was. They erased the evidence before there was evidence. Convenient when you can do that under the cloak of darkness. Can't get off the stage without pointing out that the Commonwealth is all over this. Eliza Manningham Bueller, and this is where you know that I must be absolutely mad. Head of the Secret Service, MI5, was the architect of this thing. Yes, I said it. There you go. She was the head of the Wellcome Trust at the time this happened, along with Jeremy Farr. Did you know that? This was a UK intel op. You're not supposed to say that in Commonwealth countries. You're actually not supposed to say that in any country because they get pissed when you say it. But the problem is, that's who it was. Julia Gillard, that wonderful prime minister from Australia who was so rock solid when she was prime minister. Woohoo! Also leading the mass genocide. Jeremy Farr, Dame Amelia Fawcett at State Street, and none other than our lovely friend that we like to point out all the time, Dustin Moskowitz, the co-founder of Facebook, who funded all of this so he could get CRISPR technology approved under an emergency use authorization. That's right, gene editing needed to have something to edit. And we know from Dolly the sheep and every other experiment that we did, we know that the public wouldn't accept it. So what we're going to do is we're going to defile every child, every newborn, every mother, every gestating mother. We're going to defile all of them so we can do what? Build the inventory of people who need gene editing in the future. Oh, shit. Did he say that out loud? Yes, he did. See, people, this was about profit at the cost of human life. This was genocide for hire. That's what it was. And until we embrace that that's the reality we're dealing with, we're fooling ourselves. I'm going to end with this slide. Do we need Nuremberg 2.0? The answer is we don't, because Nuremberg was wrong. We need something more akin to what South Africa did at the end of apartheid. We need truth and reconciliation. But for that to work, you have to have three elements. First of all, you have to have absolute disclosure of the truth. And until anyone, by the way, has the courage to stand on a stage, me, naked on a stage for that matter, so nobody can have a bug in my ear or anything else. I'll sit naked on a stool. And the other side with all of their computers, all their information, whatever they want. If they can take down a single one of my facts, I'll shut up. But here's the problem. They can't. There was a several hundred thousand, went up to, I think, $1 million challenge after Plandemic came out for anybody to go on stage with me and debate a single fact that I said. Nobody would take it. So here's the bad news. Nuremberg's not what we need. We need truth, and we need to have the email communication between the people that did all this. That needs to be unredacted, and it needs to be in public. Number one. Number two, we have to have contrition. Because this is not a say you're sorry. This is contrition. This is actually the remediation that says we are stopping gain-of-function research. We are going to UBC, and we're going to look at the money that was laundered through UBC to enable biowarfare, and we're going to actually out every single person involved in that. And that's the kind of thing that we have to do. We have to do the same thing at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We need to do that everywhere we can go, because every person involved in this needs to actually have a contrite response to this, not a I was doing my job at the time. Because the job at the time was known by 2018 to be premeditated murder. That is not a job you can ever hide behind. And you never will be able to hide behind, so don't pretend. So it's truth, it's contrition, and then under Crown law, you have something that's very unique. We don't have it in the United States, but you do have it here in Commonwealth. You have the ability, under fraudulent inducement, to have the aggrieved party be recovered to their pre-aggrieved state. Hear what I said? That means every small business, that was closed. That means every person who was injured. That means every person who had a loss of life, loss of employment, loss of anything else, has to be returned to the condition they were before the violation happened. Did you hear what I just said? Before the violation happened. You know what that means? That means Pfizer and Moderna have a legal obligation to find out how to fix the shit that they put into people's bodies. That's their legal obligation under Commonwealth law. And until we've done that, we have not even come close to justice. Ladies and gentlemen, I love the fact that 5 years into this thing, and now 23 years into fighting for humanity, I have never had to retract a single word I've said. Not once. Because you have not heard my opinion. Every single one of these things is a referenced fact. You can look them up. And the reason why what's happening here tonight is so critical is it is time for the cabinet of Alberta to, for the first time on the planet, have a group of elected officials stand together and stand for the first time for humanity. And just between us chickens, that was worth me flying up to Alberta and hanging out in Calgary to let you know that if you ever have anybody in that community that is going to have the courage to stand up, you've got one bald bow tie wearing penguin upside down. Yes, if you look closely, the penguins are upside down because that's how you show that you're in distress. That was, by the way, for the environmental movement. I wanted to make sure that they knew I cared about penguins. I have a maple leaf tie, but it's not red and white, so I didn't wear it. The point is, you have an ally. You have an army of allies, because the fact of the matter is, we, the people, can stand together. And it's time that we all do. Thank you very much, and have a good night.